Every day, more than 100,000 flights take off around the world. Modern airliners constantly transmit their position, communicate with air traffic controllers, and are tracked by satellites from thousands of kilometers above the Earth. Aviation has never been safer or more connected. Yet despite all of that technology, aircraft still disappear. Some vanish over remote oceans where no distress call is ever heard. Others disappear into mountain ranges so vast that search teams spend years looking without finding a single piece of wreckage. One commercial jet was even stolen in broad daylight and has never been seen again. These aren't stories from the early days of aviation. Every one of these disappearances happened after the year 2000. So how is it still possible for an aircraft to simply vanish? These are the most mysterious aircraft disappearances of the modern era. The first mystery begins on May 25, 2003, at 4 de Fevereiro Airport in Luanda, Angola. Sitting on a remote section of the airport was a Boeing 727, an aircraft nearly 154 feet long and weighing more than 100 tons. It had once flown passengers around the world, but after changing owners several times, it had been left parked for over a year while undergoing repairs. The aircraft had become a headache. It owed thousands of dollars in unpaid airport fees, required extensive maintenance, and couldn't legally return to service until the work was complete. Among the people working on the aircraft were Ben Padilla, an experienced American pilot and flight engineer, and John Mikel Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo. Neither man raised any concerns among co-workers. They were simply part of the restoration team. Then, late that afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Without filing a flight plan or requesting permission from air traffic control, the Boeing suddenly began taxiing toward the runway. Airport staff watched in confusion. The aircraft wasn't supposed to be flying. Even more puzzling, a Boeing 727 normally requires a crew of at least 3 people. Yet, investigators believe only Padilla and Mutantu were on board. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, none of its navigation lights were illuminated. It lifted into the air, climbed away from Luanda, and disappeared. Air traffic controllers repeatedly attempted to establish radio contact. Nothing. Then, the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts an aircraft's identity and location, was switched off. Within minutes, one of the largest passenger aircraft ever built had effectively vanished. No radar track, no radio transmissions, no emergency calls, nothing. Initially, investigators feared something far more sinister. Just 2 years after the September 11th attacks, the idea of a missing Boeing 727 immediately raised concerns about terrorism. American intelligence agencies, including the FBI and CIA, became involved, fearing the aircraft could be used as a weapon. But as the investigation unfolded, no credible evidence ever supported that theory. Another possibility was insurance fraud. The aircraft had become an expensive burden, sitting idle while airport charges continued to accumulate. Some speculated that its disappearance was a deliberate attempt to collect an insurance payout after secretly flying it to another location. Others believe the aircraft simply crashed into the Atlantic Ocean after an inexperienced crew lost control. The problem is that no evidence has ever supported any explanation. No wreckage has washed ashore, an emergency locator beacon was never detected, and no satellite images ever revealed its location. Despite international investigations lasting years, the Boeing 727 has never been found. More than 2 decades later, one question remains unanswered. How do you lose an aircraft the size of a commercial airliner? Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last time investigators would ask that question. Just 2 years later, another aircraft disappeared. This time, investigators knew exactly when things went wrong. On June 20th, 2005, a Piper PA-34 Seneca lifted off from Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas. On board were pilot Nathan Ulrich, Jennifer Blumen, and her 2 young children. They were returning home to Fort Pierce, Florida, a journey expected to take less than an hour. For the first part of the flight, everything appeared routine. The aircraft climbed normally, checked in with Miami Air Route Traffic Control, and turned northwest toward Florida. Then, 16 minutes after takeoff, the flight suddenly changed course. Nathan Ulrich transmitted a chilling message over the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, I've lost the engine, I'm descending." Those would be the last words anyone would hear from the aircraft. Seconds later, it disappeared from radar. Air traffic controllers immediately diverted nearby aircraft to search the ocean below, while the US Coast Guard launched an extensive search and rescue operation. But the conditions couldn't have been worse. Thunderstorms were moving through the area. Heavy rain reduced visibility. Strong winds and rough seas complicated both the aerial search and any chance of spotting floating debris. Unlike large commercial aircraft, the Piper wasn't equipped with an underwater locator beacon that could continue transmitting after sinking beneath the surface. Once it entered the Atlantic, investigators had little more than its last known radar position. For 4 days, Coast Guard aircraft and rescue vessels searched thousands of square miles of open ocean. They found nothing. No floating wreckage, no fuel slick, no luggage, no sign that the aircraft had ever been there at all. While investigators believe the engine failure forced the aircraft into the ocean, exactly where it came down remains unknown. It's a reminder of just how unforgiving the Atlantic can be. Even when investigators know roughly where an aircraft disappeared, the ocean has an extraordinary ability to erase almost every trace. But 5 years later, investigators encountered a disappearance that didn't look like an accident at all. It looked like a hijacking. The previous disappearances appeared to be tragic accidents. The next one was different. From the very beginning, investigators suspected that somebody had deliberately made this aircraft disappear. On June 10, 2010, a small Cessna 206 lifted off from Maria Rachel Newman Airport in Nazca, Peru. On board were 7 tourists and 2 crew members. The flight wasn't transporting passengers between cities. Instead, it was one of Peru's most popular sightseeing tours, taking visitors over the famous Nazca lines. These enormous geoglyphs, carved into the desert thousands of years ago, can only truly be appreciated from the air. It was a route the airline had flown countless times. The aircraft climbed away from Nazca, circled the ancient markings below, and after around 30 minutes, the sightseeing portion of the flight was complete. The pilot radioed the airline to report they were heading back to the airport. It should have been another 10-minute flight. The aircraft never returned. When it failed to land, the airline alerted authorities, who immediately began searching the surrounding desert. Unlike an aircraft disappearing over the ocean, investigators believe this one should be relatively easy to find. The Nazca region is remote, but the aircraft hadn't flown very far. Then, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Police discovered that 2 of the passengers had boarded the flight using fake identities. A short time later, investigators reportedly detected a mobile phone linked to the pilot in southern Peru, close to the Bolivian border, hundreds of miles from where the aircraft was supposed to be. Search teams expanded their efforts into mountainous terrain, using helicopters, aircraft, and ground crews. Still, they found nothing. Attention quickly shifted away from an accident. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting the 2 passengers traveling under false names had connections to drug trafficking organizations. Authorities began considering a far more disturbing possibility. The sightseeing flight may have been hijacked. According to Peruvian investigators, criminal groups had reportedly been looking for a modern aircraft capable of transporting cocaine from remote jungle airstrips. A tourist flight operating on a predictable schedule with minimal security would have been an easy target. If that theory is correct, the pilots and legitimate passengers may have been forced to divert the aircraft before disappearing somewhere deep inside Peru. No wreckage has ever been recovered. No confirmed sightings have ever been made. More than 15 years later, nobody knows exactly what happened to the aircraft or the 9 people on board. But compared to what happened 4 years later, this mystery would receive relatively little attention. Because in March 2014, an aircraft carrying 239 people disappeared, and the world watched it happen in real time. Shortly after midnight on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport bound for Beijing. On board were 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 777, one of the safest and most reliable long-haul aircraft ever built. By 2014, the 777 had accumulated millions of flight hours and earned an exceptional safety record. Nothing about the departure suggested anything was wrong. The captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, was one of Malaysia Airlines' most experienced pilots, with more than 18,000 hours of flying experience. His first officer, Fariq Abdul Hamid, was nearing the completion of his training on the Boeing 777. The aircraft climbed normally toward its cruising altitude. Weather conditions were good, systems appeared normal. For almost 40 minutes, MH370 looked like every other overnight flight crossing Southeast Asia. Then, everything changed. At 1:19 AM, as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, Captain Zahari made what would become one of the most famous radio transmissions in aviation history. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Nothing about the transmission sounded unusual. Moments later, the aircraft's transponder stopped transmitting. To air traffic control, MH370 had suddenly disappeared. Initially, controllers assumed there had simply been a communications problem. Aircraft occasionally lose radio contact. Sometimes, crews forget to change frequencies. Usually, they call back within minutes. MH370 never did. Unknown to civilian controllers, military radar had continued tracking an unidentified aircraft. Instead of continuing toward Beijing, it made a sharp turn back across the Malay Peninsula. Whoever was controlling the aircraft appeared to know exactly where radar coverage began and ended. The aircraft followed established navigation routes rather than making random turns, suggesting deliberate inputs rather than an aircraft struggling with mechanical problems. It flew back across Malaysia, then turned northwest over the Strait of Malacca. Eventually, it disappeared beyond military radar as well. For several hours afterward, investigators believed the aircraft had simply vanished. But it hadn't. They just didn't realize something else had been quietly communicating with it. Investigators now knew that MH370 hadn't simply disappeared from radar, it had continued flying. The question was, where? The answer came from a system almost nobody outside aviation had ever heard of. Although the aircraft had vanished from radar, one onboard communication system continued responding to hourly signals from an Inmarsat satellite. These weren't phone calls or text messages, they were tiny electronic handshakes, automatic responses that simply confirmed the aircraft was still powered on. Each handshake lasted only a fraction of a second. It didn't reveal the aircraft's exact position, but it did reveal something almost as valuable: its distance from the satellite. By analyzing each hourly handshake, engineers produced a series of giant arcs stretching across the globe. Every time the aircraft responded, investigators knew it had to be somewhere along one of those arcs. When they connected them together, an extraordinary picture emerged. MH370 hadn't flown north towards Central Asia, it had turned south. Far south, out across one of the most remote parts of the Indian Ocean. That meant the aircraft had remained airborne for almost 7 hours after disappearing from civilian radar. It also meant everyone searching in the South China Sea had been looking in the wrong place. What followed became the most expensive search operation aviation has ever seen. More than 24 countries joined the effort. Military aircraft scanned the ocean from above. Ships searched the surface for floating debris. Eventually, the operation shifted underwater. Specialized sonar equipment mapped vast sections of the seabed. Autonomous underwater vehicles descended thousands of meters below the surface, searching terrain that had never been explored before. In total, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent, yet the aircraft remained missing. One reason is the sheer scale of the search area. The southern Indian Ocean is one of the most isolated places on Earth. Some sections are deeper than 6,000 meters, nearly 4 miles beneath the surface. The ocean floor isn't flat. It's filled with underwater mountains, deep trenches, cliffs, and volcanic ridges. Finding an aircraft in that environment is often compared to searching for a single shipping container somewhere across an entire country. And investigators didn't even know exactly where to start. Then, more than 16 months after the aircraft disappeared, something finally appeared. On July 29, 2015, a 6-foot section of an aircraft wing washed ashore on Reunion Island, east of Madagascar. Investigators quickly confirmed it belonged to MH370. Over the following years, additional pieces of debris were discovered along the coastlines of Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, Mauritius, and Madagascar. Some were officially confirmed as coming from MH370. Others were considered highly likely matches. The discoveries proved one important thing. The aircraft had entered the southern Indian Ocean, but they still didn't reveal where the main wreckage lay. The ocean currents had carried the debris thousands of miles from the crash site, making it almost impossible to trace them back to their exact origin. More than a decade later, several theories still exist. Some suggest a catastrophic mechanical failure. Others point toward a fire or rapid decompression. But the leading theory remains that someone deliberately diverted the aircraft. Investigators noted that the aircraft followed established navigation routes after turning back across Malaysia. The transponder and other communication systems were disabled in sequence rather than all at once. The turns appeared controlled and deliberate. No evidence has ever emerged proving exactly who was responsible or why. Without recovering the flight recorders and the main wreckage, investigators cannot reach a definitive conclusion. For years, the official search remained suspended. Then, in 2025, marine robotics company Ocean Infinity returned to the southern Indian Ocean under a no-find, no-fee agreement with the Malaysian government. Using a new generation of autonomous underwater vehicles capable of operating deeper and more efficiently than ever before, the company focused on a much smaller search area based on updated drift analysis and satellite modeling. As of July 2026, the operation has not recovered the main wreckage, but investigators remain optimistic that advances in underwater mapping and robotics could eventually solve the mystery. More than 12 years after MH370 disappeared, it remains the greatest unsolved mystery in modern aviation. Not because investigators know nothing, but because they know just enough to understand how extraordinary the disappearance really was. And while MH370 became the world's most famous missing aircraft, it wasn't the last. Just 2 years later, another aircraft carrying nearly 30 people disappeared over the Indian Ocean. This time, it belonged to the Indian Air Force. On June 8, 2017, 24-year-old Alex Simons and his girlfriend, Cindy Robillard, rented a small Piper PA-28 Cherokee in Alberta. Alex had recently earned his private pilot's license. He had fewer than 100 hours of total flight experience. The couple planned to fly from Lethbridge to Kamloops, British Columbia, with a fuel stop in Cranbrook along the way. The first leg of the trip was uneventful. After refueling in Cranbrook, airport staff warned Alex that weather conditions were beginning to deteriorate over the mountains ahead. Storms were moving into the region, visibility was dropping, strong winds were developing across several mountain passes. As a relatively inexperienced pilot, flying under visual flight rules, those conditions should have been a warning. But after waiting for a short time, the couple decided to continue. It would be the last confirmed sighting of the aircraft. Not long after takeoff, heavy rain, hail, and even snow began moving through parts of southeastern British Columbia. Wind gusts reached more than 60 kilometers per hour. Investigators believe Alex may have attempted to navigate through the mountains, while visibility rapidly disappeared around him. No distress call was ever received. No emergency locator signal was detected. When the aircraft failed to arrive in Kamloops that evening, search crews were immediately dispatched. Over the following weeks, the search became enormous. Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft flew hundreds of hours. Volunteer pilots joined the effort. Ground crews searched forests, valleys, and remote mountain slopes. Helicopters scanned areas inaccessible by road. Still, there was nothing. Then, nearly 2 years later, a pilot came forward with information investigators had never received. He reported seeing an aircraft matching the missing Piper flying near Kimberley, British Columbia, shortly after it disappeared. That new lead focused attention on an area known as a Lost Dog Valley. Families organized their own searches. Volunteers brought drones, ATVs, helicopters, and search dogs. Once again, nothing was found. The terrain itself may hold the answer. The Canadian Rockies contain some of the most rugged wilderness in North America. Aircraft wreckage can disappear beneath dense forests, avalanche paths, or steep cliffs that are almost impossible to search from the air. History has shown that aircraft lost in these mountains have sometimes remained hidden for decades before being discovered entirely by accident. As of July 2026, neither the aircraft nor its occupants have ever been located. For Alex and Cindy's families, the search has never truly ended. Looking back, each of these disappearances seems impossible. A stolen Boeing 727 that vanished without a trace, a family lost somewhere in the Atlantic, a sightseeing flight that may have been hijacked, a military transport swallowed by the Bay of Bengal, a young couple disappearing into the Canadian wilderness, and of course, MH370, the aircraft that transformed the world's understanding of aviation tracking. Modern aircraft are safer than ever before. They're monitored by radar, satellites, GPS, air traffic control, and sophisticated onboard systems. Yet, these cases prove that our planet still contains vast oceans, remote mountains, and isolated wilderness where technology reaches its limits. Some of these aircraft may eventually be found, others may never be. But until the final wreckage is recovered and investigators can read the flight recorders, the biggest questions surrounding these flights may remain unanswered forever.